38 years old. Started out as a paper girl. Now I own the company. Who'd have thought I'd be this successful? Well, I sort of did. 22 employees now. Gotta make smart decisions. Benefits, pensions, 401ks. Think they can trust an old paper girl to keep things going? Always have.
Smart people plan for success early, and they choose a smart bank. First Star, where the people are Main Street friendly, and the advice is Wall Street smart.
This is CNN.
Is the U.S. military discovering a new domestic purpose? Are Allied flights over southern Iraq changing Saddam Hussein's behavior? Can overseas customers keep U.S. defense industries in business? Welcome to Newsmaker Saturday in Washington. I'm Charles Bierbauer. We'll ask the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney.
From Washington, this is Newsmaker Saturday with Charles Bierbauer.
On a mission of mercy, the military has brought food and shelter to the discomforted of Hurricane Andrew.
We are a disaster relief agency. In reality, we get heavily involved in that. We have all over the world.
The military suffered itself. Homestead Air Force Base was wiped out by the hurricane. President Bush has pledged to rebuild it.
Homestead is very important to our military. It helps combat the cocaine trade, it provides air defense, and it will be rebuilt.
At a time when other bases are closing, the president's commitment raised political eyebrows. Florida has 25 electoral votes. So too did the announcement in Fort Worth of a $6 billion sale of F-16 fighters to Taiwan at the risk of offending China. Texas has 32 electoral votes. And as defense budgets contract, defense contractors need new markets.
The country that dropped missiles down smokestacks, that created a technological miracle like the F-16, can and will create the products the world needs in the new era of economic competition.
There were no missiles being dropped down smokestacks, but U.S. and Allied planes have been enforcing a no-fly zone for Iraqi planes over southern Iraq. Officials say Iraq is complying. But a new danger materialized over Bosnia as UN relief flights came under fire, and an Italian plane crashed, reportedly shot down, in a war the U.S. and its allies find too volatile to quell. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us. With me is CNN's military affairs correspondent, Wolf Blitzer. Let's start with Yugoslavia, or what was once Yugoslavia, with the shoot-down of the alleged shoot-down of the Italian plane this week. Relief flights have been suspended. Are you in a position now where you're going to cut off flights, or you're going to force those flights through with whatever means you have available, including fighter escorts?
Well, the decision to halt the flights basically was made by the United Nations, and we concurred in it. Certainly we agreed with it. If I had to predict, I would expect it'll probably be temporary. But we'll clearly want to consult with the other nations that are participating and try to assess how serious the situation is. We don't know for absolute certain that this was a shoot down, but the evidence increasingly would seem to indicate that the plane was shot down. It's a classic example of how difficult it is to operate in Yugoslavia.
Can you tell if it was by whom it might have been shot down?
No, because the area in which it occurred is occupied by different competing factions. There are Muslims in there, there are Serbs in there, Croatians, and who they report to, who might have actually fired, if it was fired upon. All of those things are very much up in the air. And if it was shot down, it probably was done with a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile from the ground. Fighter escort doesn't help much in that kind of situation. It's a difficult, complex situation to operate in, but clearly we want to resume those humanitarian flights, and we're prepared to do what we have to see that happens.
But the president has said in the past that he is prepared to use force to get the relief through. Acting Secretary of State Eagleberger said so again on Friday, saying, to quote Mr. Eagleberger, "We will use force." What kind of force do you use to guarantee it?
Well, we have made a decision, the President's made a decision, that we're prepared to use our air and naval assets to support the effort. There are other nations that have agreed to put some troops on the ground, for example, to escort convoys on the ground. And working through the United Nations in a coordinated way, we'd have to put together some kind of operational plan to continue these missions. Now, my hope would be that they'll be able to get the various factions on the ground to understand that it's in everybody's interest for the humanitarian missions to continue and that those won't be interfered with. But if you get into a shooting war to get humanitarian supplies in, then clearly that becomes a much more difficult proposition. And of course, the danger is that the combat would become so intense that it would literally shut down the relief missions.
Well, the U.S., Mr. Secretary, has flown in lots of C-130s into Sarajevo, just like this Italian plane that apparently was shot down. That very easily could have been an American plane.
Right.
Well, isn't there something that can be done about that to prevent these kinds of attacks, if in fact there was an attack?
Well, such as what?
Well, you're the Secretary of Defense.
That's right. You can go in and occupy the ground from which the rounds were fired, or apparently fired. That you're talking about thousands of personnel on the ground. This is a very rough, very mountainous terrain. You could talk about providing cover with helicopter gunships, and if someone's foolish enough to fire a missile at a transporting craft that's inbound, you could then in fact attack those spots. You could begin to use flares to divert heat-seeking missiles away from the aircraft. So there are various ways you could operate if in fact we have to operate in that kind of an environment. I think we will be successful, and I would hope that the UN will make the decision to resume the flights. Clearly we're going to be concerned about our personnel. That's got to take precedence, and we don't want to operate in an area where the risk is greater than the benefits warrant.
Is the U.S. participating in this investigation into the cause of this crash of the Italian plane?
We're involved. It was an Italian aircraft, of course, and there have now been interviews with some of the people who supposedly were on the ground at the time. There are eyewitnesses who claim that there were missiles fired at the aircraft. I can't say that we've got independent confirmation at this point that it was shot down, but all of the evidence that is available does point in that direction.
Mr. Secretary, when you were here just a month ago, you said that there is no strategic interest for the U.S. to get more deeply involved in the question of Bosnia. Has that changed, or is the U.S. prepared to even accept the disappearance of Bosnia without getting involved?
Well, I would, I guess, question the notion that we're not involved. I think we are involved. I think we're involved in a very extensive way diplomatically. Working through the United Nations, working with our friends in Europe in terms of imposing, for example, the sanctions, economic sanctions on Serbia, the humanitarian airlift missions, the provision of air cover, and naval support for the exercise. What we've been reluctant to do, Charles, is to put U.S. combat forces on the ground to get involved in the civil war that's raging inside Bosnia. And I think our view in that regard hasn't changed. It's not that we aren't concerned about what's going on there, we are, but some situations don't lend themselves to sort of a massive military solution, and this may well be one of them.
Shift, if you would, to another humanitarian effort, the relief flights into Somalia, and bring us up to date on the status there, how much is going in, and what kind of conditions. Is that a parallel situation to Yugoslavia?
The situation in Somalia is if anything, even more complex. There is no government left in Somalia. It's the closest thing I've ever seen to anarchy, where you've got armed roving gangs, clans that are fighting with one another. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million people who are in danger of starvation. Food supplies become a major commodity in that kind of venture where people fight over the food supplies, and the well-armed gangs, of course, always prevail. We now are operating through Kenya, through Mombasa and Wajir in Kenya, and have staging bases there to make C-130 flights into Somalia with relief supplies, and those efforts are now underway. We have a significant number of people committed to the effort, several flights a day going in. We're part of an international venture there as well, and there are a number of private relief groups involved as well, but it is another dangerous situation. We are working with the United Nations. We'll soon be moving in Pakistani peacekeeping forces that the U.S. will provide the lift for. We have some combat forces present just in terms of being able to provide security for our own people, but we don't have them on the ground in Somalia. They're simply accompanying these flights and standing by should they be necessary, should they be required in terms of rescuing one of our units.
Mr. Secretary, is the Bush administration prepared to make the same commitment to the starving people of Somalia that you've made to the people in Bosnia, namely that you will use military force to ensure the humanitarian airlift of food into Somalia?
We are committed to participating in that relief effort. What's happened in Somalia, a number of people have been turned into refugees and have fled down to the Kenyan border. We can get access to them there and provide relief for them there. But the toughest problem are in places like Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia. And there we are working with through the United Nations to try to get some peacekeepers on the ground to stabilize the situation. We also are in a position where we have to negotiate with some of the so-called warlords in Somalia who control various pieces of turf, who have the armed forces, irregulars, if you will, militia, that are actively involved in the conflict. And we're prepared to do everything we can, again, to help and to be of assistance. We do not want to put U.S. ground combat forces on the ground in Somalia. We have no intention of doing that. It is strictly a humanitarian kind of a venture with enough security provided to safeguard the lives of our people.
But that may be necessary to ensure that food gets to those people, because by all accounts, the problem isn't getting the food in so much as distributing it without losing it in the process.
Problem has been getting into airports, having airports that were secure, but we're making some progress there. We now have 2 airfields we're operating in Somalia. And you're right, the problem is once you get the food on the ground is then the distribution system, but much of that has to be negotiated out with the warlords or handled by private relief organizations or ultimately handled by blue-helmeted peacekeeping forces if that becomes necessary. But we're working all of those angles to try to deal with the problem.
2 quick questions about Iraq before we take a break. One, the no-fly zone in the south, it is working, I gather. You've seen no Iraqi challenges either in the air or on the ground?
That's basically correct. We haven't seen any challenge from the Iraqis to the no-fly zone. They are still operating on the ground, but we didn't give them any direction with respect to ground operations.
And secondly, a report out of the United Nations that the Iraqi nuclear capacity has been reduced to 0 as a result of both the war and the inspections. Is that accurate as well?
I want to reserve judgment until I see the final official report from the last inspection, but there's no question in my mind but what we've done very serious damage to the Iraqi nuclear potential. The thing I'd be concerned about, though, before I was prepared to make the judgment that it was 0, would be that there are still capabilities that have been hidden that we don't know about. And I think the inspection regime is vital in order to keep Saddam Hussein from trying to regenerate his program. As long as we have inspectors going in there periodically, he does not have the ability to really resume trying to produce nuclear weapons. So I think we need to maintain that regime of continuous inspections and make certain that we found everything. I'm not prepared yet to make the judgment that we've taken it to 0.
Okay, I want to ask you about some arms sales, including some potential sales into the Middle East when we come back. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Okay, say you're a countertop and you find yourself with this blueberry stain. Now, you know there are some kinds of powders that are harsh and can scratch. So, would you want to be cleaned by one of them? Or would you go for the soft scrub with Clorox bleach, which lifts out tough stains without harsh scratching? So, what's it going to be? A harsh powder or soft scrub with Clorox bleach? Ooh, wise choice. Soft scrub with bleach.
Yeah.
Preferred by countertops everywhere.
Hello?
Jean? I thought you were getting out.
Oh, hi, Ellen. Well, the doctor said more tests.
I thought he said you were fine.
Well, I guess they just want to be sure.
So, when are the tests?
Well, he said they can't schedule anything right now. So he said as long as I'm here, I might have to stay until Tuesday.
Oh.
Maybe Wednesday.
Oh. How's the food?
Want to trade? What you got? Give me an orange juice, I'll give you my sandwich. I got a sandwich. Give me an orange juice for my donut. Half deodorant. Deal.
There's nothing like 100% pure Florida quality orange juice with the vitamins, minerals, and taste that make you feel so good.
Hey, you drank more than half. I had to. My half was at the bottom.
100% pure Florida quality orange juice. It makes you feel so good.
For months, you've listened. Now it's your turn to be heard. People like you talk about this country's future and election issues important to all of us. CNN and Knight Ridder present a Larry King Town Meeting, September 13th, 9:30 Eastern on CNN.
Mr. Secretary, before we get to those arms sales, Wolf has a question about Iraq.
Just to tie up a loose end, you suggested a few moments ago that the warning to the Iraqis not to fly below the 30-second line, did not include a warning against any Iraqi ground activity. Are you giving them a carte blanche to go ahead and do to the Shiites whatever they want?
No. My reference was specifically to the no-fly demarche that we sent them, and that dealt with air operations. They're still under the provisions of the UN Resolution 688 that directs them not to conduct military operations against their minorities. So they are not to operate against the Shia in the South.
Mr. Secretary, there's a report that says the White House is going to block the sale of F-15 fighters to Saudi Arabia because Mr. Bush doesn't want to tangle with the Jewish lobby in an election year. Fair? Accurate?
No, I don't think that's accurate, Charles. I think the accurate way to state it would be that no decision's yet been made, but many of us, including myself, are strong advocates of an F-15 sale to Saudi Arabia. They're good friends and allies. They have legitimate security requirements, and we ought to help them satisfy those requirements.
Is that part of the...
It's also good, I think, from our standpoint, to have a U.S. firm be the one that sells those aircraft to the Saudis.
Sounds like you think it will go ahead, and perhaps shortly. Is that part of the agreement for operating out of Saudi Arabia, even though the Saudis don't like to talk about it?
No, it's really stands on its own merits. We've sold them F-15s before. This is a new version of the F-15. It has a greater capability, but I think it makes a lot of sense to go forward with it. But as I say, no decision has been made yet by the administration, no final decision on timing or on the scope and size of the sale. That's a presidential decision. The president's not yet made it.
The president did announce this past week that he's going to sell F-16s to Taiwan, regardless of what mainland China might think about that. Some people think that's more a political decision than it is a geopolitical one.
Something that's been in the works a long time. The timing is in part driven by the fact that the Taiwan aircraft inventory is aging. They've got F-104s that they got back in the 1950s and F-5s. The Chinese, mainland Chinese, have just acquired Su-27s, which is a state-of-the-art top-line fighter from the Soviets. So selling F-16s to Taiwan makes sense from our standpoint. It keeps one of our production lines open. It doesn't cost us anything in terms of our own defense budget because they're good cash customers. And we have the opportunity to make a sale of important U.S. equipment. So I think it's good economically, but it also makes good sense from a defense standpoint.
But you know as well as I that the president makes these announcements with a lot of fanfare in states that have a lot of electoral votes where he's got to scramble. And the way it is being presented on campaign tours, doesn't that raise and allow this a little bit of political cynicism?
Well, you could suspend the operations of government for the next 2 months. That's one option. You know, we could say, well, this is a campaign year, and if we go help the people in South Florida, people might say, gee, that's politically motivated, and we could just let those poor folks sit down there and wait until after the campaign's over with. The world doesn't work that way. The president is president now. He was elected 4 years ago. He has to be president every day right up through the election, and he has to continue to make decisions and do the business of government. And there's nothing we can do about the fact that frequently when he makes a decision like that in the middle of a campaign, people will point a finger at it and say, gee, that's politics. But he has to make the tough decisions, too, the ones that don't necessarily help him in an election. So I think it all balances out, and I don't pay a lot of attention to those kinds of charges.
Mr. Secretary, regarding domestic politics, the president also announced this week that he was going to support the rebuilding of the Homestead Air Force Base in South Florida. In the past, you've always said that the Defense Department, money from the Defense Department should not be used as a jobs agency or for social welfare, but for national security and defense. You're now prepared to admit that this is not a decision that was made strictly out of the national defense interest.
I think that's a fair statement, Wolf. I have argued that we should not divert defense money to non-defense purposes. But I think this is a unique set of circumstances. That's how the president looked at it, certainly, that the devastation that struck South Florida is the worst natural disaster in the history of the country, twice as much property damage as ever before. That the best way for us to demonstrate our commitment to the people of South Florida, that we're determined to help them rebuild, is for us to go rebuild the major federal facility in the area, and that's Homestead Air Force Base. In addition to that, it's also an important military facility. It's been the heart of our counter-narcotics effort in the Caribbean. It's been where we had Joint Task Force 4 established, a major facility covering Cuba and that part of the hemisphere. So there are good military reasons to do it as well, but there's no question the president made a decision specifically for the reason of signaling that commitment to the people of South Florida that we're going to help them rebuild, and I think it's a good decision. I support it. I think it is a unique one-time exception, but I think it makes sense.
Well, if the federal government is going to spend a few $100 million to rebuild a military facility in order to generate economic activity to help the economy there. Wouldn't it have been better in the long term to spend those few $100 million on a non-military infrastructure, something to promote high-tech industry or tourism, so that the people there are not going to continue to be hooked on the dependence of that one, perhaps unnecessary military facility?
I don't think so. First of all, I don't think it's an unnecessary military facility. I think it's a necessary one. We've got to have a place to locate the F-16 wing that was there. We do need a counter-narcotics center. I mean, there are good, solid reasons why we ought to continue to operate that way. And there's already a major investment that is embodied in what's there. We don't have to go build runways. The runways are fine. We do have to go back and restore the buildings that were knocked down as a result of the hurricane. But again, I come back to the proposition that I don't think it invalidates the basic notion that we want to resist the temptation to spend defense money for economic purposes. But this is such a unique, historic event, and the devastation down there is so overwhelming that the president, I think, made a very solid, sound decision that using his authority that we would, in fact, proceed. Now, the Congress gets a shot at it. They have to approve our rebuilding of Homestead Air Force Base, and they'll get a chance to approve or disapprove it.
We've got less than a minute left. Let me ask you one other question on a separate matter. Governor Clinton's draft status is in the air again. Over at the White House this week, Marlon Fitzwater, the spokesman, said that a politician, a candidate's draft in military service is an absolutely valid issue for discussion in a campaign year. Quickly, do you think that Mr. Clinton has correctly explained his draft status? Do you think that is an issue as Secretary of Defense? Well, as Secretary of Defense and as one who did not serve in the military himself, and the fourth secretary didn't, there's sort of two issues that you get raised by this debate. One is the question of whether or not there should be a requirement for anybody who serves in high office to have served previously in the military. I don't think there should be. There never has been. We've had presidents and secretaries of defense without prior military service. The separate issue from that, and a different issue, the one that I think is raised with respect to Governor Clinton, is this issue of whether or not he dealt properly with the draft board when he was eligible for the draft, and whether or not he has in fact told the truth and leveled with us. I don't know. I don't know the specifics of it. It seems to me that there are questions there that have been raised that he needs to answer, and that's part of the legitimate debate. Those are two separate questions. All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being with us. I'll be back with a political observation in a moment.
Now, Billy, can you stand up?
I'll try.
That's good, that's good. Now, can you walk to that table over there?
I don't know.
Walk to the table. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. That's real good.
Yeah.
You know, your mama's going to be real happy to see you walking.
All right.
The music you love is part of your life. Now, there's an easy way to collect the world's most beautiful music. Announcing great composers from Time Life Music. Start with the greatest music of Mozart. More than 2 full hours of his very best works at the remarkable low price of only $9.99 for 2 compact discs or 2 double-length cassettes. Great Composers brings you the most memorable music of Bach, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Chopin, all the great masters in crisp, clear sound. Every volume features one great composer, yours to preview at no risk. Keep only the albums you want. There's no minimum to buy, and you may cancel anytime. So call now to enjoy Mozart for a 10-day free audition and discover music you'll enjoy for a lifetime. Here's how to order.
To order, call 1-800-825-3800. That's 1-800-825-3800. Or send just $9.99 for 2 cassettes or 2 compact discs, plus $3.50 shipping and handling to Mozart, P.O. Box 1880, Department 2, Alexandria, Virginia.
Labor Day weekend is the traditional kickoff for the fall presidential campaign, but this campaign has already had half a dozen kickoffs. In reality, to extend the football metaphor, the teams are back on the field after a halftime locker room tongue lashing. And there are many I've talked with who believe Ross Perot will trot back on the field late in the fourth quarter to drop kick the election into confusion. A field goal is worth 3 points, and in some states, 3 points would be enough to change the outcome. Tomorrow, more on politics and disasters, not necessarily synonymous, when the Vice President's wife, Marilyn Quayle, is the guest on Newsmaker Sunday. Mrs. Quayle has made disaster relief her cause and has just returned from southern Florida. Newsmaker Sunday airs at 10:30 a.m. Eastern here on CNN. Now for Wolf Blitzer and all at Newsmaker Saturday, thanks for being with us. In Washington, I'm Charles Bierbauer.
For a transcript, send $5 to Journal Graphics, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203, or call 1-303-831-9000.
They're rambunctious, full of energy, and in constant motion. They're kids. Unfortunately, not all kids are like this.
That's why Kellogg's Rice Krispies, you know, the cereal that talks, has something really important to say. From now until September the 5th, every time you buy a box of Rice Krispies, Kellogg's will give $1 to the Muscular Dystrophy Association. That's right, $1 from Kellogg's every time you buy Rice Krispies.
Because someday we'd like to see Jerry's kids just be kids.